Supernatural experiences can happen seemingly at random. However, some people find a certain thrill in looking for the supernatural. In today's video, we will be going over 4 stories, from urban exploring to haunted houses, and even the deep woods. These odd experiences will certainly send a shiver up your spine. A huge thank you to the writers, whose links can be found in the description. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. If you enjoy the video, feel free to support it with a like and a comment letting me know your thoughts. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. I've always been a bit of an adrenaline junkie, always doing crazy stuff that worried my parents and friends to the point of near heart attacks. My favorite activity, and the one that was the most tame, was urban exploration. Sneaking into abandoned buildings, usually at night, and going wherever my curiosity and inhibition took me. Not a lot usually happened though. I'd take some cool pictures, avoid cops or security guards. Sometimes I'd even be out all night. One night in particular, however, has been forever burned into my mind, and rattled me to my very core. So much so that it stopped me from ever setting foot outside of my studio apartment, or ever being in the dark by myself ever again. Celestial Valley Mental Asylum. On the outskirts of the town I called home, sat the largest abandoned building in Chesterville County. It was also rumored to be the most haunted. It was a classic example of an overcrowded, understaffed asylum, with poor care ideals. Numerous stories about it have circulated over the years, usually to scare kids from going near it, but I never believed any of it. I thought it was all BS. As I got older, I constantly planned to make it yet another destination I visited in the dead of the night, against the wish of literally everyone else in my life. March 29th, 2019. I had taken today and tomorrow off of work, since tonight was the night I ventured into Celestial Valley. I slept most of the day, waking up around 6 o'clock in the evening. I ate cold pizza as a breakfast, and packed a small bag with my camera, granola bars, a couple bottles of water, my pocket knife, a small first aid kit, and a flashlight. I also put my phone in the bag, as a last resort to emergency call. I'd had a few accidents in the past, so I knew to be as prepared as possible. After making sure I was well prepared for the overnight venture, I locked up my apartment and exited the dimly lit complex. I got on my bike and began the 1.5-mile trek to the decrepit asylum. 7:30 p.m. As I'd hoped, I got to the dirt road just as the sun was hitting the horizon. I put one foot on the ground and glanced at the withering wooden sign. The paint had almost completely chipped and peeled off, making it hard to read. I then looked down the long dirt road that led to the asylum. The building was once a brilliant, perfect white, but now spotted with rust and chipped paint. It was easily 3 or 4 stories tall, and was overgrown with ivy and some other foliage that had decided to make themselves at home on the outer walls. Most of the windows had been shattered, or covered with 2x4s. I was suddenly overcome with a sense of unease, which I quickly shook off. None of those stupid stories are real, I scolded myself. It's just another abandoned building. I biked my way up the road, finding a massive bush to hide my bike and jogging the rest of the way up. After searching for the better part of 15 minutes, I finally found a way in through one of the broken windows. I threw my hair up into a ponytail and gingerly tossed my bag inside before climbing up the ledge and jumping through the space. My nose was suddenly assaulted by the musky, tank smell that came with most aged buildings. But this was different. It almost smelled sickly sweet, like death. It made me want to vomit. I looked around, golden sunlight illuminating parts of the building. Clearly I hadn't been the only one to sneak in here. Graffiti coated the walls like a quilt. All sorts of different numbers, symbols. I think I even recognized a few band logos too. What caught me off guard though was the large symbol on the untouched wall. It evoked anger and malice, and would look cruel to even the most sadistic mind. It didn't really look like it was written with spray paint. Shaking my head, I picked up my bag and decided to delve deeper into the building, going down the first hallway I saw. It all looked like something straight out of a horror movie. There was the occasional gurney against the wall, papers on the floor. I couldn't help but roll my eyes a little. I glanced at the walls, which looked similar to the building's exterior. I had to admit, for all the horror stories that were told about this place, I was a little... Out of nowhere, I heard a loud bang. I froze, eyes widening as I whipped around so fast I actually got dizzy. Once I steadied myself, I was shocked to see the gurney I was now a good 10 or 15 feet away from now on its side, one of its wheels swinging gently from the impact. My brain tried to piece together what could have happened, but when it couldn't, I simply kept walking away. My feet picked up the pace a little as I removed the bag from my shoulder, pulling out my phone and putting on some music. Despite not seeing any cops or security, I kept the volume low. Anything to fill the void of silence and calm my pounding heart. 9:45 p.m. I've only just now found a staircase that led to the second floor. This place was a lot bigger than I thought. At least I'd gotten some cool pictures though. Nothing else too creepy had happened, aside from the occasional breeze creating an odd whistling noise. The sun had long since set, so I was using my flashlight to navigate the cobweb and mold-ridden duty halls. My music kept softly playing as I turned a corner, stopping dead in my tracks at what I saw. The hall looked strangely clean, pristine actually. There wasn't a single speck of dirt in sight, and it was fairly well lit. Still, it remained empty, void of any signs of life. That is, until I took another step forward. Suddenly the hall was filled with people, half of them restrained to gurneys. Doctors shoved patients around from room to room, some of them screaming like deranged animals. Those that weren't strapped down were trudging around like mindless zombies. It left me frozen with shock and confusion. What is going on? Suddenly it seemed as if everyone was slowly filling into a different room within the hallways. Before I could call out again, all the doors slammed simultaneously. I jolted violently out of being startled, and I was brought back to a dark, damp, musty hallway. I looked down, noticing my flashlight was now on the floor. I reached down, picking it up and brushing it off with a shaky hand. Calm down, Leslie. It must have been a hallucination, from hunger or dehydration maybe. I told myself, but it didn't sound very convincing. I decided to venture back to the first floor, feeling I'd done enough exploring on the second floor for now. 12:15 a.m., March 30th, 2019. I guess I did a fairly bad job of exploring this place. I walked into one room and it led to another series of hallways. Only these looked a bit cleaner, like someone had been here recently. The feeling of unease suddenly grew exponentially, and my gut was telling me to turn back and get out. Wiping some sweat from my forehead, I took careful steps down the hallway, ignoring the feeling, constantly looking around me. Leslie, Leslie, came a distorted sing-song voice. I whirled around, shining my light in all possible directions around me, but nothing was there. I huffed quietly in frustration, shaking my head and turning back to face the direction I was heading in. My mind was clearly playing tricks on me, but I wasn't going to let that stop me. As I continued down the hall, I was caught off guard by an awful smell, one that I could only recognize as the smell I noticed when I first entered this place. I made a face, feeling my stomach churn as I pressed on. I lowered my flashlight from straight ahead of me to towards the floor, keeping an eye out for any dead animal that could be the source of the odor. I turned a corner, freezing. Ahead of me was a large room, but there was light coming from it. I quickly shut off my flashlight and turned off my music, putting the flashlight in my back pocket before carefully stepping forward. Worst case scenario was that it was the cops, and I could just book it out of there if it was. Suddenly I felt my foot step in something liquid. Confused, I looked down. Seeing a dark puddle, I carefully reached down, sticking a couple fingers in it. It doesn't feel like water, I thought. Feeling bold, I shined the light of my phone on my hand. I wish I hadn't. The liquid was dark red, and it didn't take me very long to figure out what it was. I felt my head spinning as I wiped the blood on my shorts. Why was there blood here? Was it an animal's, or was it... A tortured scream pierced the air. My head shot up as I recognized it was coming from the lit room. Okay, definitely not cops in here. I stood up straight, carefully walking towards the room as I pulled my knife from my front pocket. I flipped it open and held it defensively as I snuck up to the doorway, hiding off to the side and poking my head in. I really wish I had just turned and left. The first thing I noticed were the numerous candles that adorned the room. Then I noticed the 5 or 6 hooded figures that all stood in a circle. They were all speaking a language I could only assume to be Latin, which sent a dangerous chill up my spine. The last 2 things I saw, and probably the 2 most haunting, were the pentagram and the girl that laid in the center. She had to be no older than me, maybe 21 or 23 at most. She had long blonde hair, tied down to the ground with a pentagram carved into her flesh, surrounded by symbols that gave off a feeling of wrong. She trembled, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Please let me go," she begged. Her plea fell on deaf ears, the chanting slowly getting louder. I looked around the room again, spotting something I hadn't noticed before. A massive goat's head, horns curling before pointing upwards. It was hung on the wall, its black, beady eyes boring into my very soul. Blood dripped from the clean cut, creating a small puddle on the concrete floor. Another scream came from the girl, which ripped my attention from the goat back to her. I watched in horror as one of the hooded figures carved into her skin, but I couldn't see what it was. Her screams turned into shrieks and painful sobs, making my heart pound in my throat, tears of my own stinging my eyes. At the same time, I wanted to throw up. Finally, the figure moved, revealing the same symbol from the front carved into the poor girl's flesh. The room became filled with an aura of pure darkness, as crimson blood ran from her body and pooled at her side. Her skin was pale, tears continuing to flow down her cheeks, forming puddles on the side of her head. The chanting grew louder, and I felt the earth tremble. I looked around the room, eyes going back to the goat. Its maw was now open, blood dripping from it. I felt my face drain of all color, as I felt the head captivate me into its horrid gaze. It screamed Leslie, voice deep and distorted, like it was coming from Satan himself. I turned and booked it away from the room, not caring how loud I was about it. I didn't bother to look back, but I could swear to God I heard footsteps, or hooves, something chasing me. It only made my feet carry me faster, skidding around corners until I reached the window I came from. I leapt through, tucking and rolling to the dirt with a grunt. I stood, looking behind me as I tried to catch my breath. I saw a dark, hulking figure running towards the window. It let out an unnatural bellow, like it was trapped in the asylum. As I took off again, sprinting to the bush that hid my bike, I grabbed it and hopped on, pedaling as fast as my feet would go. I almost crashed my bike 3 times before making it onto the road, speeding away from Celestial Valley Mental Asylum. 3:30 a.m. I finally walked into my apartment, the door gently slamming behind me. I turned on the lights before I collapsed to the floor, letting out a broken, pitiful whimper. The adrenaline was gone. Now it was time for the fear and shock to take over. My body trembled on the carpeted floor as tears fell, images of whatever I witnessed flashing through my mind. What is going on? I'd always been alone in my whole big house up until recently when I started to sense some unfamiliar presence drifting about. My house has 7 bedrooms, a dining room, a main room, a basement, a big spacious kitchen, and about 4 other rooms I barely go into. Every room has lights and the house never goes a night without illumination, but the lights in the corridor to the room in the farther end, one of the rooms I hardly visit, have been going on and off by themselves. And even when I flip the switch off, the problem never seems to cease, and so I find myself thinking what anyone would. That it was a circuit problem, a connection problem, or a power surge. I got an electrician the next day, and he told me there was absolutely no problem. I thought I could sleep it off. I really thought so, but strange noises started coming from the room. From groans and moans, to the flipping of switches. Sometimes I could even hear mumbling and muffled screams. I live alone and I'm not a superstitious person. I barely involve myself with social life. I have no friends except my family, and they're miles away from me. I'm also not a religious person, so I thought it might be some trespasser I never crossed paths with, considering how big the house is, but I couldn't shake the thought that something was wrong. That night, despite having turned all the lights in the entire house on, I took a flashlight with me just in case, and I started towards the room. I was about 6 paces away when the lights in the entire house went off. There was a big window in the corridor, but it was on the farther end from where I was, and even the light pulsing from the moon and streetlights wasn't enough to shake off the darkness from the corridor. I tapped the button on the flashlight with shaky hands, expecting light to burst from it, but there was only darkness and it was absorbing me at the moment. I checked to see if there were any battery cells, and they lodged perfectly on their deck. A loud bang came from the door of the room. It was so loud it made me jump, and the torch fell from my grip. Every inch of my body was telling me to run from that door, to run from my house, but I still did it anyway. I scruffily shuffled towards the door, hearing gentle tapping on it from the inside, and when I closed the distance, it was suddenly silent. The silence was eerie, enough to send 1,000 stupid thoughts in my head. Call me resilient. I clutched the doorknob with my sweaty, shaky cold hands, and slowly turned it. A click came from it, and I pushed the door open, but it didn't budge, so I stepped away from it, getting ready to kick it. I lunged my foot forward on target, but before I could set it in, the door was flung open, sending me crashing inside. With a loud bang, the door was shut, leaving me in absolute darkness. And then something brushed against my arm. The smell from the room was foul, a nasty odor almost like there was a decomposing body. I stood up ready for an encounter with the devil, and started thrusting my arms around, but I felt nothing. Then I got blinded as the lights flooded the entire house. Hastily turning everywhere to see my opponent, as my eyes slowly adjusted to the brightness, I was appalled to find out that I was back in my bedroom. I am now thinking of putting the house on sale, but I'll only be pressing forth this evil to them. What should I do? This isn't really a scary story, more like a spooky little anecdote, I guess. For as long as I can remember, my sister and I were raised by my mom. I've always had vague memories of having a dad, but he kicked the bucket when I was 2, and my sister was just 1. Needless to say, I never really knew the guy. There were no pictures of him around the house, and Mom never really spoke of him. And we never thought to ask, as far as we were concerned. It was just Mom and us. I remember asking her about him once, only once, on my first day of freshman year at high school. Cancer. She murmured. It came and went, and came back. It was pretty nasty, and she never mentioned him again. Raising 2 kids on her own was rough on Mom, and as a result, she was rough on us. I never got the feeling she loved us, as much as she tolerated us, and raised us to the best of her capacity, always staying within that margin of motherly duty, or maybe just well enough that no one would call CPS on her. Even now, the clearest memories I have of her face are of a tired scowl with a cigarette hanging from its lips. I won't lie, it was hard to shed a tear when I heard she passed. Don't get me wrong, I still loved her and it still pained me to hear the news, but that was about it. I was, strangely enough, less anxious about burying Mom than I was excited to see my little sister again. I hadn't seen her since she moved out for college this time last year. When she hopped off the Greyhound, she looked like she was on a similar boat. This blows. I know. And that was pretty much it. We're having a cup of coffee, going over Mom's stuff, all of it mixed up inside a box kindly provided to us by the care home. We're remembering the not-so-great memories of our childhood, struggling to separate the good times from the bad when it came to Mom. My sister mentioned something I hadn't given much thought to in years, since I moved out actually. When I was a kid, I used to have sleep paralysis episodes, seemingly at random. They started when I was like 4 or 5, happening once every month or two. But as the years went on, they became more and more frequent. It came to a point, when I was 9, where they'd happen pretty much every night. My sister and I shared a bedroom for most of our childhood, a single-parent family struggling to make ends meet. Imagine that, right? I only got my own bedroom when I was 10, and Mom had to sell the washing machine for rent money, vacating the laundry room. That's about the time my episodes stopped happening. For a while, I'd joke with my sister, saying they were her fault, and that the real cure was to sleep away from her and her loud snoring. She didn't snore, but thankfully, she always took it as nothing more than banter. As the months went on and the episodes stayed behind, so did the jokes, and with time, even the memory of them was just a faint recollection. So when she brings up the episodes, I have to take a step back to really remember them, and oh boy, the image in my mind is vivid. I could see her bed from my own, what with the small bedroom space, and when the paralysis kicked in, she was pretty much dead center in my view. Everybody jokes nowadays about sleep paralysis demons, being these big, scary, SCP-looking creatures, or these strange black figures crawling on the walls, but mine was actually really plain. It looked like a tall, white man, but I could never make out any remarkable features about him. It was always dark when he showed up, darker than I'd remember it being when I'd fallen asleep, like he brought on an extra layer of pitch blackness along when he came. The only thing I could see was the weird mark on his neck, running from underneath his shirt, up towards his right ear, stopping just shy of the hairline. It was a long, narrow scar, like he'd been cut with a knife or something. The figure didn't really do much during my episodes. He'd show up, stand over my sister, with his right-hand side turned to me. Sometimes he'd put a hand to her chest, or crouch over to lean in closer to her face. Then he'd slowly walk over to me and place a cold, firm hand against my shoulder, and I'd fall back asleep like a baby. I could never tell how long this lasted though. Some nights it felt like a couple of minutes, others it seemed to go on for hours. I'd mention it to Mom on occasion, but she'd less than gently tell me to go away because she was busy. As often happens in these cases, my sister was my only outlet in regards to this for years. There we were, going through old photo albums and reminiscing on this. You always made it sound like a pleasant experience, she remarks at one point, which, in hindsight, was probably the weirdest part. When I drop one of the heftier, older albums onto my foot. Butterfingers, I know. Photos of Mom as a kid and her childhood home came loose from the old pages, the glue clearly not surviving the test of time, and a few well-placed cusses later, I started picking up the pictures while Sis puts them back in their place. I then noticed one of the pictures has another one stuck to its back, like it's been hidden away on purpose. I snapped the second picture loose. It's a wedding picture of Mom, probably the only one to still exist, with her as Dad, and my sister and I take a minute to let it sink in. In all my 25 years of life, this was the first time I'd seen a picture of the old man. My sister remarks how much I look like him, with a chuckle, but my eyes fixate on the image, petrified. Running along his neck is a scar, long and narrow, like a healed incision from a surgery. It popped out from under his shirt's collar, up towards his right ear, stopping just shy of the hairline. Just a side note, I decided to write this story after hearing about Reddit and no sleep a few days ago. This story takes place around a few years ago when my dad left town for a business trip. I've never told anyone this story, but I guess now I have. I used to live in a fairly wooded area, inside of a 2-story house, in a smaller area in the United States. The house is kind of creepy though. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but it's just always settling, even though it's been there for decades. If you really stay quiet and have no source of sound, you can hear a noise, like a muffled crack with a drag that lingers a small amount too long, for comfort. But this story is not about that house. It is about something even scarier. About 5 meters behind my house, it's nothing but forest, for approximately 3 miles. I'm one of those people who is just absolutely fascinated by the wilderness, but never likes going out. Knowing that my dad was out for a business trip, and he thought I was adult enough to stay out of trouble whilst he was gone, I tried changing my ways, and decided to go out into those woods. Little did I know, that would be the biggest mistake of my life. It was approaching the late evening when I embarked on my journey. I had a little caution in my step when I was deathly scared of mountain lions, snakes, coyotes, and the like. But as I went along some trails, I felt better, and got more of a pep in my step. I even got confident enough to hike a bit away from the trail. Thing is, I kind of ended up getting lost. I started to panic, and tried to find my way back to the trails. Being a coward and the sensitive teen child I was, shaking in my sneakers was my first instinct. Mind you, I was only 15 at the time. I started to walk around, growing increasingly anxious. The walking turned to running, the running turned to sprinting, and eventually the sprinting turned to sitting and crying. I was huddled up against a rock, knees to my chest, sobbing silently. This was it. I'm gonna die out here. I don't have the guts to kill an animal, and I wouldn't know how to light a fire. If it wasn't starvation, I'd definitely be mauled by a vicious predator with ill intent. I wouldn't die by natural causes, or in the military, or saving someone. No, I'd die because of my stupid decision to go off the path. I started to think about what death was like. Would I be reincarnated? Would I be in an empty void of nothing for all eternity? Would I be with God in heaven until the end of time? And even if I went to heaven, would it be for the better? I was raised in a Christian household, and was raised to know heaven as a paradise. But there was something scratching at the back of my head. Maybe heaven wasn't as great as it was chalked up to be. Stuck in my own thoughts, I slowly slipped into a deep sleep, scared and waiting for my inevitable death. Maybe I would die in my sleep. Hopefully it would be painless. Except I woke up. It was late at night, but the worst part was the ear-splitting screech that seemed to be a few feet away from me. The screech was something incomparably terrifying. It sounded like a shriek, one you would hear if a woman saw someone dead in a horror movie. But something was off. It sounded like a cry from a wounded animal being mauled was heard at the exact same time. I don't know if whatever it was killed an animal, or that it was just the noise that thing made. I didn't stick around to find out. Fight or flight was activated. I jolted up and ran as fast as I could to whichever direction was opposite of any noise. Due to my panic state, I ended up running so fast I didn't look where I was going, and tripped over a log. I face-planted into the dirt. I didn't know what happened, other than I could taste dirt and leaves in my mouth. I spat out what I could, and when I looked up, I was in shock. I was always a skeptic, but I always loved hearing about folklore and mythical beasts. I looked at that creature. Its eyes were sunken into its head that looked like a skull. Its body withered to the point of emaciation, to where I could see the bones under its skin. Its body color the ash gray of pure death, lips tattered and bloodied. Its body emitted the scent, which I could only describe as the fresh scent of a decaying corpse. Which made sense since it looked like it was a corpse, of which had just risen from the grave. I just stared as, based upon this knowledge, and basis of the thing's appearance, I was face to face with a Windigo. My body froze as I looked into its eyes. It had no eyes. That's what made me panic. Was this death? Was I already dead? Is this what death was like? Staring into a horrifying creature that was just itching to tear me to shreds and feast on my flesh? I thought of my family. I never really liked them, but I wanted to see them. As I was thinking, I noticed that the Windigo was already leaping onto me, and that's when I saw my short life flash before my eyes. My elementary years, my family, my middle school years, my family. My family was all I could think of. I wasn't even supposed to be out here, and by some miracle I was able to move. I scrambled onto my feet, but I felt a sharp sting in my back. I didn't care. Adrenaline pumped through me like it was my own blood now. I ran faster than I thought humanly possible. And by some miracle, I guess it lost interest or something. Because after a while of running, I came across a trail with a few people trying to investigate the screech I had heard a while back. Before I started running, they saw me, and they watched as I collapsed. A wound in my shoulder, and blood on my shirt. They asked if I was okay, and as one of them patched my shoulder up with the bandages in their first aid kit, I explained what happened. Their original plan was to call an ambulance, but I told them not to. It would be stupid. My family would scold me. No one would believe me. And I had a phobia of hospitals anyway. And thinking about that creature, the Windigo, it made me think about death. And knowing there would be death around me a lot in that hospital, I wouldn't be able to bear going. I'm not sure if they believed me, but they helped me to my house. I didn't feel safe though. I asked if they could escort me to my neighbor's, which was maybe a few hundred meters away. It took me a bit to realize that sting I felt. It may have been a claw from the Windigo. I didn't care. I made it out alive. I made it to my neighbor's safe, and I haven't had any incidents since. Yet I'm waiting. I feel like it will come back. It felt weird how it just left me alone. Knowing that, I don't get too much sleep at night. It scares me even thinking about the incident. And every now and then, I can hear that same screech. Yet it is usually really quiet. So quiet to the point where I can barely hear it. And it almost sounds like the cracks in my old house.